If we start the clock 5 years ago, yes, certainly knife crime has increased. But if we start the clock in the year 2000, knife crime actually peaked around 2003, 2004. Knife crime is quite a difficult thing to define. It emerges in being used by the British press and politicians and police around 15 years ago. But it's generally defined as any crime involving a bladed or sharp implement. But of course, people have been using bladed and sharp implements for a very, very long time. And it's not because there have been an increase in crimes involving bladed implements in any kind of way. So we see a peak, according to the British Medical Journal, in these kinds of injuries in around the mid-2000s. But we actually see the kind of discourse and the kind of language around knife crime actually peaking quite soon before that. And so the relationship between the increase in levels of crime involving knives and the amount of times people are using the phrase knife crime doesn't really correlate with each other. So it depends when we start the clock. If we start the clock 5 years ago, yes, certainly knife crime has increased. But if we start the clock in the year 2000, and so if we compare to those levels today, knife crime is actually down. So there's a great deal of evidence that police data is not a good way to look at so-called knife crime in the United Kingdom. And I think we're far better if we look at other kinds of data, including the kind of data that we see from the British Medical Journal, which looks at hospital admissions for injuries and deaths that involve a bladed implement. And one of the reasons for this is that we can see that the police often identify so-called knife crime offences when there's no need for them to do so. One extreme example is a young man who was picked up for having a small amount of marijuana, and with that small amount of marijuana he had a small blade that had been taken out of a pencil sharpener, and this blade from a pencil sharpener was used to cut up the marijuana. But the police recorded this as a knife crime incident because it included a bladed implement. I think the UK should certainly be worried about all types of crime and all types of violence. But I think the problem is, rather than trying to find preventative approaches to addressing the problem, they're finding punitive approaches. Generally, the government's response to knife crime has been using more policing, particularly stop and search powers. One of the most high-profile attempts to reduce knife crime using stop and search powers was an operation called Operation Blunt 2 between 2008 and 2011. So what they did was they increased stop and search massively across certain parts of London, which they said had high levels of knife crime, a medium amount over other parts where they said there was a medium amount of knife crime, and barely at all in safer areas of the city. And what they found was that regardless of whether stop and search had been increased massively, a small amount, or not at all, knife crime still fluctuated at the same level in all of those parts of London. So the people who are victims of knife crime policy are generally young people from working class communities, disproportionately from African or Caribbean or South Asian backgrounds. So we see that despite the fact that most stop and searches are for drugs, not for finding knives or guns or any other kind of weapon, this is continually given as the reason for increasing levels of stop and search.